Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Now, there has been a lot of discussion about how can the Ukraine win this conflict? Is there any possible way that Ukraine could win this war against the Russian Federation? Now, we have to look at war goals and war aim and what each side is trying to accomplish. The current objective from the Ukrainian state is to drive the Russians out of all Ukrainian territory, to include the Crimean Peninsula. Now, that's not going to happen. In terms of a direct military counteroffensive operation by the Ukrainians looking to seize the Crimea, that is not going to happen. So what are other options that the Ukrainians, in conjunction with its NATO allies, do to try and recapture the Crimean Peninsula, to drive the Russians out of the areas that the Russians currently occupy and have, for all intents and purposes, annexed? Well, they would have to get much more aggressive. They would have to fight a different type of war. Right now, the Ukrainians have suffered serious casualties. They've taken lots of losses. The funding spigot has been cut off, at least temporarily. Now, we are hearing some rather interesting information that maybe you, the viewer of our channel, has not heard about. But there's discussions about what is happening in Moldova and specifically the Transnistria region. This area here. This area here is a breakaway state that is directly supported by the Russian Federation. So you have Moldova, and this is the Transnistria region. Now, there has been discussions, there has been talk, there has been rumors about a Russian military operation, a Russian operation designed to destabilize Moldova and possibly create some sort of conflict. Now, let me hit the pause button there. It is not in the interest of the Russian Federation to create a conflict in Moldova, especially Transnistria. The Russians do not have the capability to adequately defend Transnistria if there was some sort of combined Ukrainian-Moldovan operation with directly supported by Romania in terms of a military operation against Transnistria. It would be very difficult for the Russians to come to the aid of Transnistria and support those 2 battalion tactical groups that the Russians have in Transnistria. So why are we hearing this? Why are certain Western media outlets talking about some sort of Russian destabilizing operation where the Russians could conduct some kind of operation in Transnistria? Well, it's reverse. NATO is planning a destabilization operation against Transnistria. It's not the other way around. Again, you have to look at capabilities. The capabilities for the Russians to provide support to the Transnistrians is simply not there. Compounding that, the Russians have their hands full with this war with the Ukrainians right now. So it wouldn't be in their best interest to create a situation, some sort of military hostility between Moldova and Transnistria. It would benefit the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It would benefit NATO. NATO could say that Romania is being threatened, and because Romania is being threatened, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is going to establish a no-fly zone over Transnistria and then conduct a military operation against Transnistria. That would be a proactive offensive punch against the Russian Federation that would inherently escalate the conflict. Now look, as it stands, it would be very difficult. It would be very difficult for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to bring in air power and fight the Russians directly in eastern Ukraine over Crimea. It would not be so difficult for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Again, we're looking at plausible deniability. To create a situation in which you can say, hey, the Russians decided to conduct an operation in Transnistria. We are simply defending Romania and Moldova. Could it happen? Possibly. Now that would lead to a snowball effect. At first you would have conflict in Transnistria. You would have possibly the NATO organization, NATO, conducting airstrikes against what it is declaring hostile Russian intent in Transnistria, going after the local forces, the local Transnistrian forces, and also Russian forces, very, very weak Russian forces that are in Transnistria. There's not an integrated air defense system in Transnistria. Nothing like that exists like it does in eastern Ukraine. But it would create an environment where you could start to see a direct engagement between NATO and the Russian Federation. Now, would that create an environment in which it would bring possibly the Russians to the table and negotiate about obviously certain existing claims such as Crimea and other places in Novorossiya? I don't think it'll work. I think it would create a snowball effect which would eventually lead to a direct conflict between NATO and the Russian Federation. Look, right now in Sweden, military high-ranking commanders in Sweden are saying, hey, a war is on the horizon. Keep your eye on Transnistria. NATO could very easily say, hey, the Russians have invaded Moldova. Now, it would be the same type of invasion in which we hear about NATO proclaiming that the Russians invaded Georgia. Here in the Western media, we often hear about the 2008 Russian invasion of Georgia. Now we have to ask, why did Russian forces become involved in Georgia? Well, because the Georgians invaded South Ossetia first. South Ossetia first. That's what happened. Conflict between Russia and Georgia would not have happened if Georgian forces had not entered South Ossetia. It would not have happened. Georgian forces directly attacked Russian peacekeeping forces in South Ossetia. And it led to a Russian response. A Russian response out of Abkhazia, which ultimately defeated the Georgian military, which had been built up with the help, in large part, of the U.S. Marine Corps. But every time I hear about this war on the news, when I hear about the so-called Russian invasion of Georgia, that's how the media here in the United States quantifies it, explains it, but they fail to explain what happened prior to the Russians actually entering Georgia. There was a reason why the Russians did what they did. If the Georgians would have been successful in South Ossetia, they would most likely have conducted operations against Abkhazia. And again, that just really shows you how incompetent the Georgian military is in terms of its past performance in wars in Abkhazia, South Ossetia. So that's what happened. Very similar to what could happen between Moldova and Transnistria. Again, it is not in the Russians' interest to create a conflict right now between Transnistria and Moldova and obviously Romania. It would be very difficult for the Russians to supply and support its forces in Transnistria for one glaring apparent reason. The Ukraine borders the entire eastern border of Transnistria. There are not enough Russian forces in Transnistria to threaten Ukraine. And in all likelihood, if the Ukrainians really wanted to, they could probably launch an operation and evict Russian forces from Transnistria. So that's what makes this situation very interesting. Again, you hear this talk in the West right now about a Russian destabilizing operation in Transnistria. It's not in their interest to destabilize the current situation. The Russians would be bringing in forces and resources to help prop up and support Transnistria. It doesn't want to do that. It wants to leave it as a status quo. So the question is what could NATO be planning in Moldova and Transnistria? Watch this very closely. This could get interesting. Now, other than that, there are not a lot of options for the Ukrainians. And the big reason is they don't have an air force. As long as the Ukrainians do not have the ability to deny Russia its current advantage in tactical and strategic aircraft, they are not going to win this conflict. They are not. They are not going to retake Crimea. And in all likelihood, as I've talked about in the previous video, the situation could dramatically change come 2025. So we're at a point now where Western planners, NATO planners, are asking themselves, how do we walk away from this with a win? Other than a direct conflict, meaning creating an environment, maybe here in Transnistria, Moldova, in which we first see the deployment of NATO aircraft against Russian forces. NATO is very aware that right now they are not going to win this in Ukraine. The only way they would win this in Ukraine, possibly, is with direct NATO intervention with air power. Meaning something happens on the ground in Ukraine or possibly in Moldova, Transnistria, in which NATO then declares a no-fly zone and tries to engage the Russian Air Force directly. And obviously we know where that leads to. It leads to what the high-ranking Swedish military commanders are saying. War. So watch Moldova carefully. It's not on the headlines right now. But keep your eye on this area. It is really the only option that NATO has to kind of get in this conflict with plausible deniability that they did not directly intervene. It would be more difficult for NATO to directly move forces against Russian forces in eastern Ukraine than it would be to stir something up and say, hey, the Russians are doing this in Moldova, so we have to come to the aid of Moldova. The Russians have invaded Moldova. And look, the low IQ person here in the United States doesn't even know where Moldova is. They will hear NBC, CBS, CNN say, hey, the Russians invaded Moldova. And they've threatened and attacked part of the Romanian military, which is part of NATO. So we have no choice. By law, we now have to intervene. And what does the low IQ voter here in the United States say? Huh, what? Huh? Who? What? Huh? What? Oh, all right. And then back to what they were doing prior, as the world collapses into war. Watch this very carefully. More to come. Thanks for joining us. Have a good day.